I stepped out of my car expecting the usual, a quiet return from my 6-week federal deployment, maybe a few overgrown weeds and a mailbox full of HOA warnings I'd promptly ignore. Instead, I found a priest sprinkling holy water on a tombstone that read, "Rest in peace, Mildred Jenkins," with my fence acting as the ceremonial backdrop. A dozen mourners dressed in black sobbed politely. A funeral brochure fluttered at my feet. On the cover? My property. My land. Labeled as Tranquil Pines Community Memorial Garden, a proud HOA project. I hadn't just missed my mail. I'd missed the part where someone turned my land into a graveyard while I was gone. I didn't say a word at first. I just stood there, taking it in, the folding chairs, the floral arrangements, the canopy tent with a catered buffet, and the man playing a sorrowful tune on a clarinet near my barbecue pit. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I'd somehow driven to the wrong house. But no, that's my address on the mailbox. That's my dog's favorite patch of dirt beneath the new gravestone. And that is definitely my garden gnome being used to prop open a cooler full of bottled water. My hands clenched. My brain snapped to attention. And somewhere deep in my chest, I felt the kind of furious stillness that comes right before a very legal, very satisfying storm. A middle-aged woman in pearls and a wide-brimmed hat clomped over in heels, clipboard in hand, face oozing smugness like a leaky faucet. "Oh, you must be Mr. Parker," she said brightly, barely glancing at me. "You missed the blessing, but don't worry, we recorded it for the HOA newsletter." She extended a manicured hand like she was presenting a Lifetime Achievement Award. "Karen Whitley, HOA President and Cemetery Initiative Chair." I stared at her hand like it was a rotting fish. What the hell happened here? Her smile faltered just a hair. "It's our new community project. The HOA voted while you were out of town. We figured your land would be the perfect spot for a memorial garden. Quiet, peaceful, practically unused. Because I was gone." "Well," she said with a flutter of fake laughter, "that did make it easier. Less red tape." I tried to stay calm. I really did. But when I looked around and saw a second tombstone with the name, Eugene Buddy Larkins, engraved over a fake marble angel, I lost my cool. "Are these people actually buried here?" Karen smiled wider, like I'd just complimented her flower arrangement. "Just a few. We expedited the permits while you were overseas. Military, right? That's what Mrs. Petrovich said. We figured you'd understand." "Understand? I was a federal agent for the Department of Housing Oversight. I don't just understand housing law. I write the damn reports that determine which HOAs get audited. And right now, I was standing in what appeared to be a criminally unlicensed graveyard built on my own private land without my consent. The problem was, I couldn't say any of that. Not yet. My work is supposed to stay confidential, at least until formal investigations begin. So instead, I forced my face into something resembling a confused homeowner and muttered, "You built a cemetery. On my land. While I was gone. Without my permission." Karen huffed. "Look, the board voted. You didn't reply to the notice we mailed. I was on a federal assignment in a classified location." "Well, not my fault you didn't check your mail," she chirped. My jaw twitched. "There's no mail service where I was." Karen waved her clipboard. Then it was unanimous. You didn't object. The silence counted as approval. That's not how consent works in any civilized nation, let alone one with zoning laws. But the real kicker came when I saw the portable toilet parked near my shed, decorated with a lace ribbon and a sign that read, "Bereavement Use Only." I took one step toward it and nearly tripped over a mound of freshly packed dirt, with a small wooden marker sticking out of it. No name. Just the word "reserved." At that point, a woman in black approached Karen in tears. "Thank you again," she sobbed. "My mother wanted to be buried somewhere meaningful. I just wish she could have met the landowner." Karen beamed. "Oh, I'm sure he would have approved." I turned to her, ready to detonate, when something caught my eye. Behind the crowd, tucked beside my shed, was a trailer. A construction trailer. It had the logo of a company I recognized from a previous investigation, Rest Solutions Incorporated. I'd seen that name pop up in a fraud report 2 months ago involving illegal grave sales on county-owned land. That case was still open. Now I knew why the pattern felt familiar. This wasn't just Karen being insane. This was organized fraud. I backed away slowly, pretending to process my grief or whatever they thought I should be doing. I nodded solemnly at the mourners, gave a weak smile, and even patted the clarinet guy on the shoulder. Once I was out of sight, I ducked into the treeline and took out my phone. First, I activated the secure channel. Then I pulled up the license plate scanner I keep in the app suite for Field Agent. Every vehicle in that parking area would be logged. Every contractor's plate, every vendor. Especially the ones tied to Rest Solutions. The next step was obvious. Documentation. I photographed every tombstone, every fake flower arrangement, every flyer and brochure I could get my hands on. I filmed Karen giving a smug tour to someone who looked suspiciously like a local city council member. And when I zoomed in on the blueprints she was holding, that land went way beyond my property line. She was planning an expansion. They weren't just burying people illegally. They were selling space they didn't even own. As I walked back toward the house, my phone buzzed. It was a secure message from a fellow agent across the state. Got your ping. Rest Solutions is under federal watch. You in? I replied with one word. Very. I stepped back out into the open and looked over the field of faux grief. Karen was posing for a photo near the Eternal Rest HOA Memorial banner. I smiled to myself. They just buried the wrong bodies on the wrong man's land. And now I'm going to unearth every secret they thought would stay 6 feet under. The next morning, before the sun even rose, I was already deep in planning mode. The smell of cheap floral spray still lingered in the air outside, mingling with the faint odor of disturbed soil and artificial grief. I stood at the edge of my property, dressed down and blending in, but in my head, the gears were grinding at full speed. The average homeowner might call a lawyer, maybe the police, but I'm not average, and I don't play defense. I started by setting up a few discreet motion-activated trail cams in the trees. They were designed for wildlife, but they'd catch every car, every conversation, and every shovel that crossed into my yard. I wasn't just documenting what they had done. I was about to catch them expanding. And they would. Scammers don't know how to stop once they think they've gotten away with it. Their greed is their schedule. And I was already ahead of it. By midday, the first truck arrived. A battered white van with Eternal Rest and HOA Harmony painted on the side in bubble font. It parked behind my shed like it owned the place. 2 men got out carrying folding chairs and another polished tombstone. I recognized one of them. David Monroe. Former contractor, current scam artist, and one-time subject of a federal complaint that had mysteriously disappeared under local pressure. Now here he was, trespassing on federal land he thought was just some absentee's backyard. I stayed hidden, watching through binoculars from my attic window. My trail cams were blinking like Christmas lights, storing everything. The van's plate matched the list from Rest Solutions Contractor Network. Confirmation enough. I took a deep breath. I couldn't bust them yet, but the fuse had been lit. That afternoon, I drove down to the county records office under the guise of being a curious homeowner. I asked to see any zoning changes or temporary use permits filed for my address. The clerk, an older woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, scrolled through the database and frowned. Nothing had been submitted. Nothing had been approved. There was a single filing from the HOA 3 weeks ago labeled Community Memorial Petition, but it was stamped, denied. Requires landowner consent. She looked at me, puzzled. Did you sign something? No, I said, smiling faintly. But someone's about to get buried for saying I did. Back home, I reviewed the footage from the past 12 hours. In addition to the van drop-off, there were multiple visits from HOA board members, including one who brought a portable credit card reader and handed out envelopes to a group of elderly couples in golf carts. They were giving cemetery tours. Real ones. One man even measured out grave dimensions using a plastic wheel and spray paint. My land was turning into a subdivision for the dead. What made it worse, what made it unforgivable, was how casual they were. They weren't hiding. They didn't think they needed to. I watched Karen arrive in a Mercedes SUV, wearing oversized sunglasses and a t-shirt that read, "Rest with Dignity. HOA Proud." She posed for pictures next to a sign that had gone up overnight. Plots available, limited time rate. Members get priority. She laughed with the others, handed someone a clipboard, and sipped from a thermos like she was running a farmer's market. I watched her point toward my vegetable garden, what was left of it, and nod. I knew that nod. That was the future expansion nod. They were going to turn my damn tomatoes into tombstones. It was time to take this to the next level. I reached out to Marcus, a fellow agent who owed me a favor after I bailed him out during a misfiled code investigation last year. He specialized in municipal corruption and had contacts with a task force already sniffing around REST solutions. When I told him what I had and where it was happening, he whistled through his teeth. "You're telling me they used your land? That's rich. You want in on the operation? I want point on it." He didn't argue. Within 24 hours, we had a sting plan. My land would be monitored, not just by me but by 3 other agents posing as land surveyors, a drone overhead on a civilian flight path, and a mobile data intercept van parked 2 blocks over in a church lot. This wasn't personal revenge anymore. This was professional cleanup. But I still needed more dirt, literally and figuratively. I posed as a potential buyer and attended one of their community burial tours. I wore sunglasses, a fake mustache, and the kind of Hawaiian shirt that screamed Florida retiree with a checkbook. Karen didn't recognize me. She was too busy sweet-talking the crowd and handing out glossy pamphlets featuring photoshopped graves over what was clearly my backyard. She bragged about seamless HOA integration, lifetime plot protection, and my personal favorite, zoning immunity due to community consensus. Consensus, huh? I raised my hand and asked, "So the landowner signed off on all this?" Karen didn't miss a beat. "Absolutely. We have written consent on file and everything." That was her second felony in 5 minutes. I smiled beneath the mustache. One of the other attendees, a sweet old lady named Donna, leaned toward me and whispered, "Isn't it just beautiful? My grandson paid for the spot so I could be close to the community." She pointed toward a marker near my clothesline. "That's me. Right there." My throat tightened. These people had no idea they were being conned. They were planning their own goodbyes on fake promises, paying thousands for holes that would either be empty or get bulldozed the moment I reclaimed my property. It stopped being funny at that moment. Back at home, I uploaded everything. Video, audio, scanned brochures, screenshots of Karen's claims. Marcus messaged back an hour later. Confirmed. They're laundering money through a shell nonprofit and using HOA dues to mask the transfers. We're greenlit. Operation Grave Mistake starts Monday. I nodded to myself. Monday would be the beginning of the end. But the part that really made me smile, the part that felt like justice slow-cooked to perfection, was the discovery I made later that night while combing through the Shell nonprofit's registration documents. Karen's little Eternal Rest and HOA Harmony was co-signed by someone very interesting, State Senator Lindsey Bowman's sister. A woman who had previously lobbied to reduce oversight on innovative burial solutions. Suddenly, everything snapped into place. The missing permits, the blind eyes, the speed of approval. This wasn't just a Karen power trip. This was a political grift, buried in bureaucracy and fertilized with other people's grief. But what they didn't know, what they still didn't suspect, was that the man they thought was just a reclusive homeowner had access to every lever they used to cheat the system. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to make threats. I just needed to keep the cameras rolling and the documentation airtight. Because soon, they wouldn't be able to dig another grave without me signing the warrant. Monday arrived with the kind of stillness that makes people nervous without knowing why. It was the kind of morning where the breeze held its breath, and birds went quiet, like nature itself was waiting for a shoe to drop. I sipped my coffee from the porch while watching the cemetery grift continue like clockwork. At exactly 9 a.m., a silver Honda pulled up and a couple stepped out carrying a bouquet and a folded check. The woman looked emotional, the man looked irritated, but they both followed a young HOA volunteer toward what was now being called Lot C. They didn't know it, but they were walking directly into a federal surveillance trap, and every word of their conversation was being recorded from 3 angles and an overhead drone. Across the street, the so-called surveyors were already in place, undercover agents in reflective vests with clipboards and hidden mic. One of them, Agent Perez, pretended to take soil samples while actually scanning underground for anomalies. Another, Agent Hughes, monitored the area's signal traffic, gathering data on phone calls, emails, and transactions coming from within the HOA office. We had probable cause for everything. We just needed Karen and her crew to walk directly into it, which, of course, they did with the grace and obliviousness of toddlers stepping on rake. By mid-morning, Karen herself emerged from her fortress-like home with a latte in one hand and a megaphone in the other. She strutted toward the cemetery and barked cheerful announcements like she was hosting a bake sale. "We're almost sold out of Phase 1 plots. Don't miss your chance to be part of our serene memorial family." She waved her arm like a cruise director. I had to hand it to her. She was so delusional, she'd turned scamming into performance art. But the best part was watching her set herself on fire with every word she said, all while smiling for the cameras she didn't know were there. That afternoon, it started. A code enforcement team from the Department of Housing Oversight, backed by agents from the Federal Bureau of Land Management, walked directly into the HOA office with a cease and desist order. No warning, no heads-up. Just a knock on the door, a stack of legal paperwork, and a polite but firm, "You're going to need to come with us." Karen wasn't there at the moment. She was at the cemetery, giving what she called a heritage dedication speech, in front of a plaque that had been glued to a rock 5 minutes earlier. When she saw the code enforcement trucks pulling into the parking lot, her face twisted into something between panic and disbelief. I made sure to be standing right behind her as the agents approached. She spun around and tried to rally her usual smug confidence. "Excuse me, what is this? You're not allowed to interrupt a private memorial service." One of the agents, a tall man named Sanderson, handed her the paperwork. "Ma'am, you are operating a cemetery without proper permits, zoning approvals, or landowner consent. You are also under investigation for fraud, money laundering, and unlawful conversion of private property." Karen blinked rapidly. "That's ridiculous. We had consent." "It was implied." Sanderson raised an eyebrow. "You forged documents and sold burial plots on land you don't own. That's not implied consent. That's a felony." For once, Karen didn't have a comeback. As the officers began taping off the area, families who had been walking toward the site with flowers and photos stopped, confused. One woman burst into tears. Another man screamed, demanding to know if his mother was really buried under the tree he'd been visiting. The crowd grew fast. Confusion turned to anger. I could see it in their eyes, betrayal layered with grief. Karen had stolen more than money from these people. She'd stolen closure. I stepped up beside her, voice low enough that only she could hear me. "You really should have read the fine print," I said. "Especially the part where I'm the federal agent in charge of HOA oversight for the entire state." Her eyes widened as the pieces snapped together. Her mouth opened, then closed. Then opened again. "You? But you live here." "Exactly. And that means you tried to scam the one person who doesn't need permission to kick in your door." Karen turned pale. Meanwhile, back at the HOA office, The other agents had uncovered the motherlode, ledgers, spreadsheets, even a wall map with color-coded stickers marking current plots, reserved slots, and high-value premium burial options. There were notes about celebrity zones, including one in the far corner labeled VIP Eternal. One file contained photoshopped images of marble headstones beside celebrity likenesses, implying that the site had hosted the remains of famous musicians. There was even a fake testimonial from someone claiming to be the niece of Elvis Presley. All of it, of course, was going into evidence. By evening, the news vans had arrived. Helicopters hovered above like vultures, their rotors chopping through the stillness that had kicked off the day. Every channel was running the same headline: HOA caught selling illegal burial plots, federal agent blows whistle from inside. My face wasn't shown, but I didn't need the attention. The story was what mattered. Neighbors came by my house, stunned. Some offered apologies. Others asked questions. One man said, "I always knew Karen was a control freak, but selling graves? On your land? That's just evil." I didn't argue. Another woman told me she had given the HOA her mother's ashes, which were supposed to be buried in a quiet corner near the rose bushes. I had to tell her the rose bushes weren't real. They were silk, stuck in foam, planted in a pot, and placed on a patch of turf over hard-packed clay. Nothing had ever been buried there. The woman sobbed. Later that night, I sat on my porch as the task force continued combing the property. Portable lights lit up the field like a football stadium. Agents in blue jackets marked off areas with orange flags. A forensic team was even called in to examine some of the plots that might have contained real remains. I watched silently, a dog-eared copy of the original Community Project brochure in my hand. The cover still made me laugh. Stock photo doves, a golden sunset, and the tagline, "Your final rest with HOA excellence." I tossed it into the fire pit beside me. By midnight, Karen had been arrested. The formal charges included fraud, trespassing, conspiracy to commit real estate theft, and forging documents related to burial right. There would be more, dozens more, as the web unraveled. Her entire HOA board was under investigation, and the county council had already begun emergency proceedings to dissolve the HOA entirely. But what stuck with me most wasn't the legal victories or the headlines. It was Donna, the sweet elderly woman I'd met pretending to be a plot buyer. She showed up that evening, confused and clutching her plot certificate. She asked me if she'd done something wrong. I told her no. I told her the only people who had done wrong were the ones who lied to her. Then I handed her something. A note with the contact info of a nonprofit that provided legitimate memorial planning for low-income families. She looked at me with soft eyes and nodded. "They picked the wrong land," she whispered. I smiled. They really did. By the following week, the fallout had evolved from scandal to full-blown disaster. Every news outlet across the state had picked up the story, and a few national ones were circling like curious vultures. A headline in bold black font ran across morning television: "Dead wrong, HOA sells fake graves on federal agents' land." The neighborhood had gone silent. No more golf carts whirring by, no HOA volunteers clipping hedges. It was like someone had flipped the suburban switch to off. The HOA clubhouse sat boarded up, locked, and abandoned. The once bustling field full of folding chairs and weeping mourners had been reduced to a taped-off zone patrolled by agents and evidence technicians. And yet, somehow, we weren't even close to the bottom of the barrel. Every time the forensic auditors opened a new folder or traced another account, they found a deeper pit of rot. The burial scam wasn't a one-time scheme, it was part of a multi-neighborhood network. Karen and her inner circle had been doing this in at least 2 other communities over the last 5 years. They started with empty lots under HOA jurisdiction, but when they ran out of space, they started targeting absentee homeowners, folks with property they assumed wouldn't be missed. I had just been their latest and unluckiest target. Except for the fact that I wasn't unlucky. I was the trap. In one of the seized folders was a file labeled Expansion Phase 3. Inside it were satellite maps marked with red flags indicating potential target properties. There were names, addresses, homeowner statuses, and disturbingly detailed notes about when certain owners were most likely to be absent. They were literally cataloging vulnerable people, tracking travel habits, medical leaves, even obituaries. One sticky note read, "Widower, traveling often, no kids, ideal." I had to put the folder down and step away for a moment. Later that day, Agent Marcus called me over to a conference room where the evidence team had laid out a string chart connecting the nonprofit shell company, Eternal Rest and HOA Harmony, with several other entities. One was a real estate development firm that had been purchasing land near cemeteries at unusually low prices, often just after the burial project's collapse. The pattern was undeniable. They were inflating the perceived community value of land with phony cemeteries, collecting burial fees from grieving families, then selling the land to insiders after its religious or memorial status forced zoning reclassifications. The developer? Owned by the same family as the HOA treasurer. It was bigger than Karen. She may have been the public face, the one bold and clueless enough to bark through a megaphone, but she was just a cog in something much greedier. And now that we were pulling at threads, they were all starting to unravel. What made things worse was that the corruption had reached deeper than any of us guessed. Remember that state senator's sister who co-signed the nonprofit paperwork? Turns out she had been lobbying for legislation to allow adaptive community burial use on HOA land without individual lot owner consent. The bill had nearly passed. Only one vote stopped it, a last-minute decision by a representative who'd gotten cold feet. When confronted with the evidence, the senator's office stonewalled, then deflected, then went quiet. We knew what that meant. Meanwhile, the community that had once rolled out the red carpet for Karen was turning on her faster than milk in the sun. At first, there was confusion, then disbelief, then rage. People had paid thousands, some had even taken out loans, for the illusion of permanence and peace. Now they were finding out that not only were the graves fake, but in some cases, their loved ones' remains had never been properly interred at all. One man discovered the urn of his late wife, sitting in a storage unit 2 counties away, stacked beside 3 others like misplaced Amazon packages. He'd held memorials, planted roses, sat in silence beside a stone marked with her name, thinking she was resting just beneath. She never was. The lawsuits came next. Fast, fierce, and massive. Class action suits were filed by families who had been duped, homeowners whose properties had been devalued, and even vendors who had unknowingly participated in the scam. One caterer had served sandwiches at 6 separate funeral events and only realized he'd been had when a picture of his van appeared on the news under the headline "Sandwiches and Scams." He showed up at the county courthouse with a statement and an invoice. The HOA board scattered. A few resigned and went into hiding. One tried to claim he had been just the treasurer and knew nothing about the burial scheme, but unfortunately for him, his signature was on nearly every transfer document. Another member attempted to flee the state but was picked up at the airport holding a briefcase full of HOA petty cash. When asked why he was trying to leave with $9,800 in small bills, he claimed he was going to pay for his mother's real funeral this time. Karen, of course, was still the main attraction. Her trial was approaching fast, and the prosecution was stacking charges like sandbags before a flood. Fraud, trespassing, forgery, tampering with burial records, money laundering, even endangering public health, since one of the fake burial sites had been set up near a community waterline. She was looking at a decade minimum. But still, she tried to spin it. She gave a jailhouse interview to a local tabloid, saying she was the victim of a weaponized bureaucracy and had only wanted to bring peace to the neighborhood. She said I was a deep state operative who infiltrated the community to destroy local freedom. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so twisted. But despite all the mess, the madness, the lies, something remarkable started to happen. The neighbors who had once been divided by petty HOA politics began working together. They organized real community meetings. No dues, no fines, no mandatory paint swatches. They cleaned up the mess Karen left behind, physically and figuratively. A local artist offered to repaint the memorial sign into something new, something honest. And the families who had been misled? They formed a coalition to help others navigate post-burial fraud, because apparently, this wasn't an isolated case across the country. As for me, I filed my final report, closed the file, and walked the perimeter of my property one last time. The sun was setting. The fake tombstones were gone. The gaping holes had been filled, the grass was growing back, and the wind carried only the smell of spring again. I stood by the place where Mildred Jenkins had once rested, or rather, where a stone bearing her name had once sat over a hollow shell, and I thought about the power of appearances. How easily people believe what's laid before them, especially when grief is involved. And how dangerous it is when someone like Karen decides to exploit that trust. But that chapter was closed now. Justice wasn't just coming, it had arrived with cameras, warrants, and handcuffs. And the ghosts Karen tried to fake? They were finally laid to rest. Not in my land, but in the truth that had finally surfaced, 6 feet above. The courthouse was packed, the way it always is when a scandal grows too big to ignore. Reporters crowded the hallways with microphones and notepads, whispering into their phones, trying to get the scoop before the others. Spectators filled the benches like it was a live theater production, eyes wide, waiting for the final act in a drama that had taken over the neighborhood, the headlines, and their evening news feed. At the center of it all stood Karen, flanked by 2 very tired-looking attorneys and dressed like she was attending a charity gala instead of standing trial. She wore pearls, heels, and the same smugness that had once bulldozed its way across my backyard. Only this time, there were no folding chairs, no fake tombstones, no HOA banners fluttering behind her. Just 4 plain walls, a judge with no patience, and a prosecutor holding a binder thick enough to knock someone out cold. I sat in the back, arms folded, watching the show unfold. I wasn't required to be there, but I needed to see it through. I needed to witness the moment when the mountain of lies finally collapsed in the one place she couldn't manipulate. Her lawyers tried every play in the book. They said she was misled by her board, that she thought the land had been donated, that the documents she signed were forged by others. They even tried painting her as a misguided community leader who had only wanted to bring people together in a time of loss. But the prosecution was relentless. Every claim was met with video evidence, scanned contracts, audio recordings, sworn affidavits, and, most damning of all, Karen's own words caught on tape. She'd made a habit of boasting to others, completely unaware that her voice was being recorded during many of those cemetery tours. She called the land a gold mine, referred to the grieving families as desperate and easy to please, and once joked that dead people don't need receipts. When the court heard that last one, there was a gasp in the room followed by a silence so thick it practically buzzed. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Her lawyers buried their faces in their note. But the most powerful moment came when the victims spoke. One by one, they stood before the judge and shared what Karen had taken from them. A woman named Sheila spoke about visiting her father's supposed grave every Sunday, believing he was resting under the tree near my old garden shed. She brought flowers, told stories, even cried to him. Then she found out there was nothing beneath the stone. She sold me peace, Sheila said, her voice shaking, and left me with nothing but betrayal. A man named Eric talked about burying his late wife's ashes in what he thought was sacred ground. He had invited friends and family to a memorial. They'd all gathered, cried, prayed, only to find out the urn was never buried. It was still in a storage locker, labeled with the wrong name. I feel like I lost her twice, he said, choking on the words. The judge didn't need much convincing. The charges were overwhelming, the evidence irrefutable. When the sentence came down, 15 years with no parole for fraud, conspiracy, falsifying records, and unlawful use of private property, Karen looked stunned for the first time. Not angry, not defiant, just confused, as if the world had broken some silent agreement she'd made with it. As she was led away in handcuffs, she turned once toward the audience, scanning the crowd like she expected applause or maybe sympathy. She got neither. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the victims and attorneys. Cameras flashed, questions flew. I slipped out a side exit, away from the chaos. I'd had enough spotlight. My part was done. In the weeks that followed, things shifted. The fake cemetery was removed completely. The last traces of the scam were dug out, hauled off, and turned into court exhibit. The property was finally quiet again. I walked the field one evening as the sun dipped below the hills, casting long orange shadows over the grass. The holes had been filled, the soil leveled, and the markers gone. In their place, nature had started reclaiming what was hers. Grass was growing. Birds had returned. The wind carried the scent of honeysuckle and warm earth. It was peaceful, the way it was always meant to be. A local nonprofit reached out and asked if they could use a portion of the land for a real memorial garden. No burials, just flowers, benches, and a plaque dedicated to those who had been affected by Karen's scam. I agreed on the spot. Within a month, volunteers had transformed the space into something beautiful. A winding path, blooming lavender bushes, and at the center, a small monument engraved with a single line, "Let truth rest where lies once stood." The community changed too. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, people started organizing their own gatherings. Potlucks, garden swaps, even a neighborhood movie night. I watched it all happen with quiet satisfaction. Sometimes the worst people bring out the best in others, once they're finally removed like the disease they are. As for me, I was promoted. The department recognized the scale of the operation and the work it took to dismantle it from the inside. I was offered a leadership role in a new task force designed to investigate HOA abuse statewide. I accepted without hesitation. Because if this could happen on my land, with me as the homeowner, it could happen to anyone. And I wasn't about to let another Karen weaponize a neighborhood again. One evening, as I was locking up the house, I spotted someone standing at the edge of the property. It was Donna, the elderly woman who'd shown me her plot certificate during one of Karen's fake tours. She held a small bouquet of wildflowers. I walked over. "She's really gone?" she asked. "She is," I said. She nodded slowly. "Thank you for not letting her win." "You don't owe me thanks. Just keep telling the truth. That's what stops people like her." She placed the flowers near the memorial and stood in silence for a moment before leaving. I watched her go, a quiet peace settling over the land once more. Karen had buried more than she ever understood: trust, hope, dignity. But in the end, it wasn't the graves that defined this place. It was the people who stood back up. The ones who chose justice over silence. Who reclaimed what was theirs, and made sure the next Karen wouldn't find an easy mark again. And as I turned back toward my house, one final thought passed through my mind like a whisper. You tried to bury your crimes, Karen. But you forgot I dig for a living.